Very often on projects, you're faced with requests to add new scope or elements to the scope that may sometimes look no big deal to add. This may come from people on your team or sometimes straight from the top senior management or the sponsor of the project. To add or not to add this kind of scope that is requested during the project will be a decision to make by you as a project manager. Here's where the scope baseline comes to your rescue. As soon as you obtain the documents from the three processes that we discussed so far, you need to perform an important step as a project manager. You see, projects are always on the move, but there are some moments at which point in time you have to force things to literally freeze and stop. This is one moment when you need to freeze upon the scope and all the activity that is going on within it and capture within the scope baseline and probably set this in stone. The scope baseline is the collective sum of all the documents we got from the previous three processes in the scope management knowledge area. These documents, as we saw, were the requirements documentation, the requirements traceability matrix, the project scope statement, the work breakdown structure, and what is not shown here, including the WBS dictionary. All these documents constitute the scope baseline. The scope baseline becomes the initial agreed upon scope between all the parties involved, and it is used as a benchmark to refer back to during later phases of the project to compare to and see the variations from it. Let's now try to understand two additional concepts that are related to the scope on the project, and those which are a source of many problems if not managed well. Here's the initial product scope to build a bicycle as part of the project, and those requirements are collected, documented, approved, and crystallized in the scope baseline on the left. Let's say after some weeks into the project, well after the project work has begun, someone important from the stakeholders wants to add a fully working single-cylinder piston engine to the bicycle to make it an engine-powered bike. Now, as you know, this is a big change to the project scope coming from someone important on the project. And the decision you have to make is, do you go ahead and make this big change to the entire project, which may lead to jeopardizing the timelines and the budget? Although this request may come from someone important, it has not been agreed upon and approved by other stakeholders on the project, which includes you, your team, and other people. This is where the scope baseline comes to your rescue to support you to prove this request was never part of the scope. Hence, your action to this request should be a big no, rejecting the request to add this new component to the bicycle. This additional request that is not approved by the project stakeholders and that which is not documented in the scope baseline is called a scope creep. Notice the word unapproved here. You can only include any scope additions by going through a project change control procedure that we will discuss later in the monitoring and control process group. Let's also say that someone in your team near the completion of the project says, let's add 2 more rubber grips to the handlebar as shown here to the bicycle. Although this is a small and benign request, which probably no one will notice if done, the question you have is, do you still include it or not as part of the project? This type of adding of new features that did not exist before and those that do not bring a significant improvement to the value of the final product is called gold plating. Hence, requests like these are also not to be encouraged and should not be included as part of the scope of the project. In our example with the pyramids, let's say the initial scope of the project was to build a single pyramidal structure that was agreed upon and documented in the scope baseline on the left. Let's say down the line, the most important stakeholder on this project, who is the pharaoh, himself requests to add an additional structure next to the original pyramidal structure, which is the Sphinx, which is an animal-like structure which is half human and half animal in appearance. Since this is a big change to the request to the original scope of the project and not approved by all the stakeholders of the project, this will be defined as a scope creep and hence should not be taken up as part of the scope of the project. Well, it's a different story in this case. You may have no choice to build it since it is coming straight from the pharaoh. And if you didn't do it, the consequences may be dire to you as a PM. Let's also say just near the completion of the pyramidal structure at the end of the project, a new request of adding a few more additional trees next to the pyramid have come in. This, as you know, does not add much value to the final product and are just incremental benefits to the final product. This is clearly an attempt to gold plate the scope of the project and hence should not be taken up as part of the project. Therefore, what we have done here is completed the scope management knowledge area by obtaining the most important output from it, which is the work breakdown structure that encapsulates the entire scope of the project through the visual representation of the various components and elements that go into the work that will be done on the project. We now have the scope baseline ready as our first major deliverable on the project. The scope baseline consists of the requirements documentation, requirements traceability matrix, the project scope statement, and the WBS. At the conclusion of this step, we now know what needs to be done on the project in terms of the overall scope that the project team will work on and deliver at the end. We will now introduce an important project management tool that is used to manage most of the project management activities, to keep track of various activities that goes on the project, view the project schedule in a structured format, manage various project resources, and keeping track of their activities on individual tasks, managing the budget and the various expenditures on the project, etc. This lecture is not going to be a detailed deep dive into how Microsoft Project works and the various bells and whistles that come along with this software, but rather we will make it a brief introduction to this software application so that it enables you to start using it quickly and through the example that we have been using so far, which is the pyramids example. There are many other software applications that do the same job of the Microsoft Project. However, it is MS Project that is predominantly used in most companies as the desired project management software. What we will now do is we'll quickly take a look at various areas of MS Project that we will touch upon in this lecture. Microsoft Project can be downloaded online and is available in various versions. And at the time of production of this lecture, Microsoft Project 2016 is the latest available version for download and individual use. Some larger companies have the enterprise version of Microsoft Project, which is called Microsoft Project Server. In this lecture, we will be discussing the major features of Microsoft Project. And for the demonstration of this lecture, I will be using Microsoft Project version 2013. At the time of production of this video, there is the version 2016 also available to download from the Microsoft website. These two versions are very identical in their functionalities, except a few user interface updates in the latest version. So you will really not miss out on any of the capabilities of the latest version from the version that we will discuss now. What you will instantly see is when you log into Microsoft Project is this huge white space that is in the form of a spreadsheet. It looks very similar to an Excel spreadsheet where you will enter your project data. On the top, this grid is broken down into multiple columns with the labels task mode, task name, duration, start, finish, etc. In a moment, we will start entering data that corresponds to our project example, and you will then understand how you would enter data for your own project. But before that, let's take a look at the other sections of this user interface. On the left, what you see is the label Gantt Chart, which actually corresponds to the Gantt chart that gets created in this space here after you have entered data into this grid. Gantt chart is simply a visual representation of the various activities that goes on a project arranged in sequential order of time and with the necessary links that indicate which activity comes first and what comes next. On the top, what you also see is the timeline that gets constructed automatically as you start entering data in these fields here. The timeline is the quintessential characteristic of any project, and as we discussed earlier, every project has a start and an end. And in the timeline is where you will know precisely when the project has started and when it will be ending, indicated by the precise dates on the timeline. On the top, you see a few menu items. We will only be using the task menu, and the other options within it. Let's now start entering data that corresponds to the various activities and things happening on our example project, which is the project pyramid. In determining what is in the scope of the project and in the scope management knowledge area, in the planning phase, we went through the exercise of constructing the work breakdown structure, or WBS. You may recall that the work breakdown structure is necessary to encapsulate the 100% of the scope of the project. In our example of the pyramids project, this is the work breakdown structure that we obtained earlier from the various inputs and processes that we used together to construct the work breakdown structure. As you may recall, we used the scope baseline documents as primary inputs to create the WBS, and through the process of decomposition, we were able to draw the various components and elements of scope broken down into this nice hierarchical structure that we call the WBS. What we will now do is, using the WBS, we will start entering the data in the Microsoft project application. The first thing that you would enter, and in the first line, is the name of the project itself. Since we're calling it the project pyramid, that's what we enter here. And as soon as you do that, you will notice an icon appear right before the task name in the task mode column. The task mode contains type of the task that you're entering. The first one is the manually scheduled task, and the other is the auto-scheduled task. Manually scheduled tasks are simply those tasks that you have full control to determine when do they start and when that task ends. We will discuss shortly the auto-scheduled tasks. The next thing that we will do is start entering the three big major components of work that are right on top of the WBS, which are the exterior portion of work, the interior portion of work, and the surroundings for the pyramid. What you now have is the name of the project, which is right on the top, and the three big major components of work that the project could be broken down into to manage those portions of work easily and efficiently. What you then have to do is, when you click on task, this ribbon appears that contains various options that helps you to modify the tasks that you enter in this grid. To keep this visible all the time, click on the pin here. Comparing this to what we have in the WBS, you can see that this was the level 1 on the WBS, which is the topmost level that corresponds to the final deliverable that comes out of this project, which is the pyramid. The next three are the three individual sub-levels that we obtained from the WBS. To make the level 2 task items appear distinct from the level above it, what we now do in Microsoft Project is click on this icon on the top ribbon that indents these tasks a little to the right to make it distinct and appear as if it is one level lower from the previous level. In order to do that, I would select the three tasks together at the same time and click on the indent task from the ribbon. As you can see here, as soon as I do that, the three subtasks appear to be underneath the project pyramid, which is the level 1. You can also now see that by default, Microsoft Project puts an assumed duration and an assumed start and finish dates. You will also notice that the task mode for the project pyramid has changed to auto-scheduled. And this is because the start and end dates of the entire project pyramid is dependent on the start and end dates of the individual tasks underneath it. These are the tasks that we will control and tell Microsoft Project to start and end on specific dates. The duration column is the column where you enter the duration of that specific task in terms of how many days, weeks, or months does the task take to finish. From the WBS, what we also have is the level 2 decomposed further down to level 3, which is the level that we decided to stop and call them the work packages. What we will now do is we will enter those work packages within each of these level 2 tasks we just created. So let's start with the items under the exterior component. We see that there are two components under the exterior, which is the stone blocks and the mortar. So let's now enter those two items in Microsoft Project. As you can see, the stone blocks and mortar correspond to the exterior portion of the scope and hence need to be written right below the task name where there is exterior. This can be done by inserting a task between the exterior and the interior line items. The way you do that is you right-click on Interior and say Insert Task. You can see a new line has been created and inserted, which is where you would enter stone blocks, since we need another one for mortar under the exterior. But as you can see, these two task items correspond to a level that is under the level 2 item. Hence, you would select those two items and do the same thing as we did for the level 2 items and click on the Indent task. As you can see now, those two tasks have now been indented and put under as level 3 components under the task name Exterior. We will now do the same thing for the interior, which is chamber and passages, and select those two, indent them to right, and roads and gardens are two other tasks under surroundings. As you can now see, the entire 100% of the WBS scope has now been put into a software application for you to be able to track its progress and provide you control on an individual component of work that is more manageable and easy to track. We will now get into